The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 13th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
"Do you see these great buildings?" asked Jesus. "Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." That had to be difficult to believe, don't you think? One of Jesus' disciples, as they were coming out of the temple, had just looked around and said, "Look, teacher, what large stones, what large buildings." This temple was a grand structure for sure. Historical documents indicate that the temple that Jesus and his disciples are looking at wasn't even fully completed at the time that they were looking at it. Construction on this building had begun around the year 20 BC, and it was not completed until the year 63, more than 80 years later. There's evidence that some of the stones that were used to build this complex were indeed grand. Some of them apparently measured 35 feet long, 18 feet wide, and 12 feet high. I mean, think of the engineering and ingenuity and innovation that it would have taken to complete such a structure 2,000 years ago, let alone today. A Roman historian described the temple complex as a mountain of white marble adorned with gold. Indeed, a true temple of immense wealth. Imagine standing there, looking at this grand structure, marveling at these giant blocks that look so permanent, and then being told by Jesus, no less, that there would be a day when not one of those blocks, one of those giant blocks, would be left standing. Kind of unfathomable, right? As you know, this past summer, I was able to travel with our Luther League down to New Orleans for the ELCA youth gathering. For me, this trip was maybe the 6th or 7th time I had visited that city. One of those handful of trips for me happened in, I can't remember, it was either late 2004 or early 2005. But I remember spending that visit enjoying the sights of the city, enjoying the sounds of the city, taking in the culture, the history, the physical landscape of New Orleans. But then it was just a few months later, in August of 2005, I still remember sitting on my couch at home watching TV and seeing the weather reports that were describing this major hurricane that was threatening the Gulf Coast, and in particular New Orleans. I think you know how that goes. It sounded quite serious, but, kind of brush it aside because it didn't really affect me. But then, as I assume you remember, on August 29th, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall in New Orleans. It was only a Category 3 hurricane. It wasn't the most destructive one to ever hit the area, but the large surge of water overwhelmed the levees in and around this underground city, and it caused the levees to topple and fall, bringing with it overwhelming flooding, massive destruction, and incredible loss of life. What large stones! How could they ever topple and fall? And yet topple and fall they did. I remember seeing all those images on TV of the places that I had just been not long before, but now broken and underwater. I remember going back to that city numerous times in the years that followed Hurricane Katrina, sometimes as an observer, sometimes as a participant in cleanup efforts. I mean, even on our trip this past summer, there were still signs of destruction nearly 20 years later. Over the years, over all these visits, I've heard stories from the residents, both those who had fled and those who had stayed. And they're just utter dismay over the levees that failed, that fell. They were built to survive, the residents would lament to us. This shouldn't have happened. But we've all had that feeling about something. I remember visiting the city of Joplin with a group from Kim's church following the destructive and deadly tornado that struck in May of 2011, seeing part of the city still in ruins. I remember driving on the streets of Bastrop, Texas during my seminary internship to witness the destruction from this massive wildfire that happened there in September of 2011. I remember the tsunami on the other side of the globe that brought a wall of water miles inland and washed hundreds of people out to their deaths. I remember just recently that other hurricane that brought massive rains and flooding so far inland that people who live in mountain towns, who never could have dreamed that a hurricane or flooding would reach them, suffered unimaginable damage and are now busy rebuilding their towns and their lives. The residents of all of these places, I think, concur. We never thought this could happen to us. I know all of us have different disasters like this etched into our memories. Maybe they were global events or national or local or maybe even personal. These are things that aren't supposed to happen, Towering buildings are not supposed to crumble to the ground. Oceans are not supposed to leap out of their seabed and flood miles inland. The ground is not supposed to shake or shift or open up into a gigantic hole. The sky is not supposed to form a funnel and destroy everything in its path. A particular disease is not supposed to affect me personally. And yet we see it happen much too often. And when these things do happen, there is loss. But not just the loss of property or a loss of life or a loss of a loved one, but a loss of innocence. Our innocence is lost when something that we once believed to be such a sure thing, it's lost when it's no longer a sure thing. A deeply rooted belief is no longer trustworthy, so we start to question what to believe. With all of that uncertainty and all of that unknown, then on what are we supposed to build our understanding of this life? On what are we supposed to trust? So the disciples, along with most of the people in their day, they put their trust in the temple. Because this was the sacred heart of their world. It was the place that God resided. And since God was immovable, the temple should have been too. So for Jesus to reply to this disciple's comment by telling him that the stones would soon be toppled, well, of course, they were stunned. Jesus, their teacher who has become the second part on whom or what these disciples are building their trust. Jesus is turning their understanding and their lives upside down. You can't trust what you once believed you could, he would say. These disciples, they're completely taken back and they want to know more. So when the disciples get Jesus alone and to themselves as they are sitting on the Mount of Olives, looking out over this grand view of this massive temple, they pretty much ask Jesus what we all want to know. Is the end near? What's going to happen? Tell us, when will this be, this throwing down of this massive building? And what are going to be the signs that it's about to happen? Help us to know. So what did Jesus say to answer their questions? Did he answer the question? Of course not. Does he ever? I mean, at least in the way that we want or expect. No, Jesus provides absolutely no answer to the question of when. And that's because Jesus is more concerned about the present time, that current moment. Jesus already knows that chaos and destruction is real. He knows that it's a part of their lives and ours. And he knows that lots of things are not permanent, including buildings, powers, emperors, even our bodies, and especially his body. He knows that all of creation is fragile. He knows that there are forces that can upend what we know to be true, to be stable, to be grand. But Jesus also knows that God is permanent, that God's kingdom is solid and more permanent than even the largest temple could ever be. It's God's presence in this world that is the constant. God's presence is what remains despite and even within the chaos and the destruction that we know and experience all around us. So again, notice where Jesus was, where he was sitting when he and his disciples were talking. They were on top, they said, the Mount of Olives. And this place not only overlooks the temple, but it also overlooks the Garden of Gethsemane. Right? That place where Jesus will go on that night when he is betrayed. That night where he will fall on his knees and pray those words, "Not my will, but your will be done." It is here on the Mount of Olives that Jesus speaks to his disciples. It says, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. But this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. As these catastrophic events occurred, as they occur, much will be revealed. Revealed to us, about ourselves, about humanity, and most importantly, about our God. Do not be alarmed, says Jesus. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. So maybe we should ask, what will be uncovered or revealed in the end of all of this? Maybe you've experienced this, but after a very traumatic event or after the end of a long fight or a battle, I often hear people say something along the lines of, well, my faith is now so much stronger for having gone through that. And I believe that God can use, not cause, that's a whole other sermon, but God can use these types of catastrophic events to focus us and reveal something. At the end of this gospel lesson, Jesus tells us that endings are not what they seem. Some endings are just beginnings. Jesus is preparing the disciples for the new beginning that will soon be before them. Jesus is offering hope in the midst of chaos and devastation. Even though there is a lot happening that makes it appear as if the end is near, Jesus is assuring them and assuring us that there is much, much more. Jesus is assuring us that God is at work, that God is present with us, that God is using us to be the way for others to experience God. Stone will not be left on stone. All will be thrown down. You will hear wars and rumors of wars. Nation will rise against nation. There will be earthquakes. There will be famines. And there will be God. Thanks be to God. Amen.